Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the NCRO Aging Information Subcommittee webinar on grieving and the grieving process. Hope everyone's having a good day. Actually, Michigan, we have a little sunshine here, which is kind of nice. Today we have three presenters or three speakers that are going to be talking to you. We have Cynthia Palmer, we have Casey Mehta, and we have Janine Roach, and that's going to be presented by Cynthia Palmer. And she is a grief support service manager at Hospice of Michigan. Cynthia has her MSHP and MCB, is a grief support service manager in the Hospice of Michigan since December of 2019. Cynthia began her hospice career at Ann Arbor Hospice in 2012. Cynthia's interest in hospice started after her father was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He moved in with her family and they cared for him at home with the assistance of hospice. Cynthia states, "It's a beautiful gift to provide my father with a home death, as that is what he wanted. I knew then that I wanted to someday work in the hospice field." Cynthia holds a BS degree in education, K through 8 from Eastern Michigan, and a MS degree in hospice and palliative studies, and a master's certificate in bereavement from Madonna University.
All right, very good. Thank you and welcome everybody to our presentation today. I hope you find this information helpful. Title of my presentation is Grief 101. We'll go over some of the common reactions to grief and things you can do to ease your way through the process, and ways you can support others who are grieving as well. So first, we're going to start with going over some myths about grieving. Myth number one, we only grieve deaths. The reality is that we grieve all types of losses. Number two, only family members grieve. When the reality is all who are attached grieve. It's very possible to lose a family member that you're really not that close to, yet grieve deeply with the loss of a friend or mentor, which would be very normal. Myth number three, grief is an emotional reaction. Well, that is true. Grief is an emotional reaction, but the reality is grief manifests in many ways, and we will get into that in more detail later in the presentation. Myth number four, individuals should leave the grieving at home. The reality, we cannot control where we grieve, and I'll take a moment to share a personal story with you all. My mother died in December of 2007, and she lived in a senior citizen apartment building prior to her death. And after she died, I was in Bush's one day, strolling with my cart through the produce section, and there in the store, I saw a gentleman who lived down the hall from her in the senior apartment building complex. And right there in the middle of the store, I became tearful. And I was embarrassed, but I couldn't control it. It was the grief was just under the surface. And when I saw the gentleman that I closely associated with my mother and where she lived, the grief was right there. So we can't always control where we grieve. Myth number five, we slowly and predictably recover from grief. Reality, grief is an uneven process. It can be an emotional roller coaster, and there is no timeline. I can't tell somebody in 3 months you'll be at this phase, at 6 months you'll be at that phase, and when you'll be completely over your grief. That's not how it works. There's many factors that impact how long it takes us to grieve. And again, we'll get into that in a little more detail later on. Myth number six, grieving means letting go of the person who died. In reality, we never fully detach from those who have died, and nor would we want to. Myth number seven, grief finally ends. The reality is that over time, people learn to live with their loss. And again, let me share a story with you that illustrates this point. I have a client who comes to one of my support groups, and she was speaking of an experience she had regarding the death of her mom, and her mother had died years ago. Was not something that was in the front of her mind. The grief was no longer just under the surface. Quite a bit of time had passed, and she had come to accept her mother's death and had a healthy grief process with that. But one day, her own daughter, came to her and announced that she was going to be having a baby. And my client was very surprised at how much she missed her mother in that moment. She wanted to be able to share this moment of hearing about her daughter going to have a baby with her mom, and she couldn't. Her mom wasn't there. So even years later, sometimes that grief can resurface. It can really catch people off guard and be surprising, but again, very normal and natural. Myth number 8, grievers are best left alone. In reality, grievers need opportunities to share their memories and to mourn and to receive support. I make a difference between the word grief and mourning. When we grieve, that's our internal process. When we mourn, that's what we do with others, talking about our loved one, performing rituals. Funerals is a beautiful example. That's mourning our loss with others. Okay. Okay, what is grief? That's a big a big topic to put in the slide, but here I go. Grief represents a set of behaviors and feelings that are a normal reaction to a significant loss or a change. It can be a loss of an object. We can grieve the loss of a role or the loss of a person. Let me give you a couple examples. A loss of an object. We grieve when we, kind of a funny example, let's say you have a favorite golf shirt. It's your lucky shirt. You wear it every time you go golfing. Something happens to the shirt, it gets ruined, and you'll have an emotional reaction to that. That's my favorite shirt. Now what? Now you have to go shopping and you have to find something else. And there's this whole transitional process, right? You lose your car. Perhaps a repair comes up that really the value of the car isn't worth doing the repair, and you know you have to get a different car. And that's the car you're used to. You have lots of memories of trips or places you've been, events you've been to in that car, and there's some sadness. And then you have to go through the hassle of shopping for another one and adjusting to all of the new bells and whistles on the new car, which can be exciting but can also be stressful. Or even losing your home. Sometimes as we age, we can no longer care for a large home or a large yard and might need to downsize. And that can trigger a grief reaction, having to leave your home maybe before you're really ready to. Loss of a role, I'll give you a couple examples there. When we retire, we're no longer an employee. We've lost that role through our retirement. Even though retiring might be something we're very much looking forward to, there can still be some grief related to that change. When people graduate from school, they are no longer a student. They lose the role of being a student. During a divorce, when we divorce our spouse, we are no longer a spouse, and our role in society changes, and the way we view ourselves changes. There can definitely be grief associated with that process. A loss of a person, of course, could be due to death, but we also lose people when they relocate. Maybe our best friend or best buddy is moving to another state. And while we can still talk with them on the phone or FaceTime, we're not going out to lunch or dinner or attending events with them anymore. That physical relationship is over. When we break up in a relationship, a romantic relationship ends, There's certainly grief associated with that. Or also when parents become empty nesters, the last kid moves out. Um, that's certainly a change. It's a loss. It's not due to death, but again, the nature of the relationship is greatly impacted and there's a big transition and can certainly have grief related to that event. Okay, considerations about grief. Remember, grief is a reaction to any loss. Grief is normal, natural, and necessary. And it's important to remember, and we'll get into this a little bit more detail later, grief is cyclical. It's not a linear progression. I'm sure many of you have heard different theories about grief. And there's different stages you go through. And while that is true, it's not just this linear, straight process. We tend to hop around the different experiences or stages of grief. Grief is a very personal experience. While there are very many common factors, common experiences that people share, it is very personal. And again, how you grieve is greatly impacted by the circumstances of the death, a sudden loss versus a long-term illness. Your own personality will factor into it. And just other stressors in your life. Maybe there's financial lack. Maybe there's lack of communication amongst family members, and there's a lot of disruption with family dynamics after a loss. There's just many factors that can impact how we grieve and how we mourn. So, what does grief feel like? We grieve on many levels. I think many people, when they think of grief, think of the emotions of grief, but there's also physical impacts, impacts our spirituality, our thoughts, and our behaviors. We'll go into this in a little bit more detail. Physical responses to grief can be many that are similar to stress reactions, such as headaches, dry mouth, stomach aches or a stomach upset, shaking or trembling. And previous conditions can flare up. Hypertension can get worse, asthma, arthritis, that's an inflammatory condition. And when we're under a great deal of stress, which we are when there's a major loss, those conditions can have flare-ups. Some people feel tightness in their chest or their throat, a feeling of being outside yourself, like a surreal type sensation, and certainly lack of energy and fatigue are very common physical reactions to loss. Emotional responses to grief, of course, sadness is one we commonly think of, but there can be feelings of shock, helplessness, envy of those who still have their spouse or their parent or their child, and we've lost ours. Anger. We can be angry at ourselves, angry at the person who died, or even angry at God. Unexplained irritability, feelings of despair, feelings of relief. Caregiving, it's been a long road of caregiving. It can feel like a relief that the caregiving experience is over. But then often people will feel guilty for feeling relieved. And again, just very, very normal. Behavioral responses to grief can include sleep disturbances, changes in your social patterns. Maybe you were very social and outgoing. Now maybe you seek more solitude, or it can go the other way around. Someone who really enjoyed their solitude now feels the loneliness of that solitude and wants to be around people more often. So change in our social patterns. Sometimes there's some avoidance behaviors. Maybe your normal drive to the grocery store takes you past the cemetery where your loved one is, and you might want to avoid that. It could be a trigger for some folks of the grief, and so they'll find a different way to drive around, avoiding walking past the room in the home where the person died. So those kind of physical avoidance behaviors are common. And of course, crying and tears are healing. It's a good thing. But again, can happen when you least expect it as well. Changes in eating habits and appetites are common. Treasuring objects that our loved ones had once owned. We call these things linking objects. And suddenly that handwritten recipe that you receive from a parent or that tie tack becomes a very treasured object and something to keep. Let's see. I think that covers that. Thought responses to grief. People are often preoccupied with the death initially, and again, that's very normal. Um, Also, we become very aware of our own mortality and thinking, well, who's going to take care of me now when I get sick? That's a very common grief reaction, something that people think about quite a bit. Um, Thoughts like it doesn't seem real, I'll never get over this, what's going to happen to me, thoughts of those nature. And together, the physical, the emotional, spiritual, behavioral changes, thoughts, this is the total pain of grief. These are some more of the thoughts I was just talking about. I'll never feel better, feelings of abandonment, thoughts of I should be over this by now. We kind of live in a microwave society, right? We want everything fast and easy, and grief is neither fast nor easy. Um, some people think, am I going crazy? I'm not going to get better. No one understands me, and I can't stop crying. So, COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 has made our grieving process a little more complicated because we don't have the same opportunity to mourn with others that we maybe once had prior to the pandemic. Um, our inability to hug our grandkids, to enjoy usual self-care activities or social activities that maybe we once would have been our go-to things to make us feel better. Just a lot of global stressors right now, supply chain issues, political issues, the list goes on and on. Um, I also have listed on here disenfranchised grief. Um, People have a lot of opinions about COVID-19, and should your loved one die of COVID-19, the circumstances surrounding their death can cause some people to lack empathy and can make it difficult for the griever to receive the support they normally would have had. Okay, the experience of grief. We're going to go through some of the stages of grief. And again, these are not linear, but are very common to the grief process. Initially is acknowledging the reality of the loss, embracing the pain of the loss, readjusting to the loss, reinvesting emotional energy into other relationships and activities, and eventually becoming reconciled to the loss. For our visual learners out there, here's a great chart. I think this really depicts this process really well. To the left, you see the initial death, acknowledging the loss, often feeling the shock. They have this colored in black. It can be a very dark time. Listed down that column under acknowledging the loss are some of the manifestations of the grief, some of the feelings, being preoccupied with the thoughts of the death, having a need to tell their story of the death. Shock, disbelief, and confusion often characterize this task. It's common for the individual to have intellectual awareness of the death, but not yet have the emotional understanding of the reality of the loss. This is the body's way of protecting itself from being overwhelmed with the full impact of the death. A period of shock can last anywhere from hours to days to months. The more traumatic and unexpected the death, the longer the shock may last. It's not unusual for shock to last from 30 to 60 days, depending again on the situation. Then the next phase is experiencing the pain, feeling a little blue, I think is what is suggested by the color of this. This can be a time of great disorientation. During this task, the individual is overwhelmed with intense emotions, thoughts, and physical reactions to grief. It is a time of disorientation when the individual fears a loss of control over themselves. It can be very disconcerting to find such intense emotion in one's body and not be able to control it. The individual may experience many conflicting feelings that are confusing and unsettling. Again, I talked about having the relief that the caregiving role is over, and then guilty for feeling relieved. So that those kind of conflicting emotions. That's just one example. Anger and guilt are two normal feelings that may accompany grief, and yet they have the potential to do the most damage if the individual cannot process them and let them go. This part of grief can last for many months. It is important to try not to escape the pain by staying busy or taking medication, alcohol to deaden the feelings of grief. We need to do our grief work. Grief really is a dual process. It is a turning inward, experiencing our grief, sharing our loss with others, but yet at the same time, still moving forward in life, doing the things we need to do on a daily basis. It's this back and forth. It's a bit of a dance. The next phase, we get to be a little bit more in the pink. We start to readjust to the loss. We're adapting. This is a time of struggling with new roles and responsibilities. The task is to adapt to the new environment. There still may be strong feelings of missing the individual and yearning to have them back. There are many challenges, like learning to be a single parent, becoming comfortable with finances, learning to cook, being single again in a couple-oriented society, rethinking parenting styles, and just many, many, many ways we need to adjust and adapt after the death of a loved one. The next phase is a little green growth here, a sense of healing. We're starting to have more emotional reserves to reinvest into developing new environments, relationships, and activities. New roles and responsibilities eventually become less painful and more satisfying. Effectively taking on these new roles and responsibilities can help give a survivor a sense of positive self-worth as they begin to feel capable of taking care of themselves. Having survived such a great crisis, they now see the light at the end of the tunnel. There is a need to reinvest emotional energy into new tasks, relationships, hobbies, and other things that will help them define the new person that is beginning to emerge. It's who am I now without the significant person in my life, and starting to develop that aspect. Eventually, things get a little bit more sunny. We become reconciled to the loss. The survivor begins to take life in new directions, and there's opportunity to focus energy on making decisions for the future and for our quality of life. The individual understands that moving on in life is necessary, and that it in no way questions their love or commitment to the person who died. They transform their relationship with the deceased from one of physical to the one of memory. They are comfortable bringing the deceased back into their lives during those special dates to celebrate the life they shared together without hurting their efforts in moving forward. They understand that grief is not the process of forgetting, but remembering with less pain. I think that's a powerful statement. We don't want to forget our loved ones, like we said earlier in my presentation, but remembering with less pain is often the goal, keeping those memories close. Here's a quote that I like. Self-compassion is simply giving the same kindness to ourselves that we give to others. When we're grieving, we're not our best self. And I remind people again and again, be kind to yourself. Things will get better. but it takes a while, and to be gentle with yourself. Okay. Part of how we get through our grief is by good self-care, and I think Janine is going to go into this in her presentation as well. So I will be brief. Um, Things you can do on the physical level to care for yourself: taking walks, doing yard work, move a little bit, join an exercise class. We carry a lot of that stress in our bodies, and it helps reduce the stress and could possibly help us sleep better too while we're under all this stress. On the intellectual level, read a book. It can be a book about grief or a book that you're reading just for pleasure. Work on a crossword puzzle, pursue a hobby, take some lessons in an area of interest, again, just to get your mind off the grief. We can't live in it 24/7. We need to take healthy breaks from it. Um, Emotional care. Another wonderful way to grieve, especially for those who are more private, is to take time to reflect and write in a journal. No one ever has to see your writing. It really is just for you. You can share with others if you wish. It can be a really wonderful way to get your thoughts organized. And as time passes, weeks and months, you can actually go back in your journal, read what you wrote a month ago, 4 months ago, a year ago, and really see how your grief has changed over time. It's a wonderful tool. Forgiveness is a big part of the grief process. No relationship is perfect. We do and say things we regret. Our person we've lost perhaps said or did things that you wish they really hadn't. And again, that forgiveness, not carrying anger and guilt with us, is a big tool, a gift really in our healing process. Joining a support group can be a way to get information and support, and going out to lunch with a friend, and so a friend you can talk to and share with. Our grief affects us on a spiritual level. So talking to our spiritual leader and your community about your concerns. How did this happen? Why did this happen? Why did God not protect me, protect my loved one? Those are all things people struggle with, people of faith after a significant loss. Listening to inspirational music, reading poetry, spending time in prayer or meditation can all help um, nurture our spirit and help us get through a difficult time. I was also asked to list a few things as far as what to say to your friend who is grieving, and maybe some things to avoid saying. So I compiled a little list here this morning and added it to my presentation. Things that you can say when someone is telling you about their grief experience. Um, we call this active listening. You say things like, "That sounds like it was really hard. What happened next? How did you respond?" So we're not grilling them with questions, but really just encouraging them to keep talking, letting them know we're engaged and we're listening. We can also say straightforward, "I'm here and I want to listen. Tell me what happened. Tell me what you're feeling." Validating their feelings. So this isn't fair, is it? Sometimes life isn't fair, but boy, it's hard when it's happening to us, right? Um, and to be concrete on how you're going to help them. I will call you tomorrow. Um, let's go out this weekend to the farmers market. Do you want to come with me? Or even, "I'm running to Target today. Is there anything I can pick up for you?" Offer some very concrete help. That can be very good. Sometimes people don't know what they need, and some people find it very hard to ask for help. So just offering it in a very forward way. They can always say no, but it can actually help people figure out what it is they really need. Things what not to say. Their death was a blessing. It was God's will. It's all for the best. You have your whole life ahead of you. You can always remarry. You can always have more children. I know exactly what you're feeling. These are things we often say. I have said them in the past myself when I didn't know better. Sometimes when people are expressing their grief, it's very intense, and we can get overwhelmed and not quite know what to say. So we kind of pull out these platitudes, right? Um, and where we're trying to help, sometimes these things can be hurtful to people. Um, what I also want to say is if the person who is grieving says these things, their death really was a blessing. They suffered so much. I'm so glad their suffering is over. They can say that, and you want to validate and normalize that if that's really what they're feeling. You just don't want to take that and try to put that on them. Um, so it can be a little bit complicated, right? On how to grieve or how to support someone who's grieving, but I don't think you can go wrong with those things um, that I listed on the previous slide about what to say. They're very open-ended, very non-judgmental, and encourages people to talk more and tell you more. For support group information, Hospice of Michigan does provide support groups. We have groups all over the state. We have groups that meet in person, and we also have groups on Zoom. So you can join from anywhere in the country, actually. If you're interested in joining one of our support groups, we do not charge for any of our support services. Uh, whether you had a loved one on our service or not, it does not matter. And more information, our support groups can be found at hom.org. Okay, that is it for me.
Okay, we're going to be taking questions now, and we've got the first one here. If you do have questions, remember you can type them into the question box and send them to us, and we will add them for Cynthia. So your first question, Cynthia, if you just read it and respond.
Sure. How is compassionate hospice care monitored in a facility that is not a complete hospice facility? When you sign on to hospice care in a facility like a nursing home, you choose which doctor is going to be your primary physician. It can be the doctor that's at the facility, or it can be the hospice physician. We have nurses aides, spiritual care advisors, social workers who will come to the facility and visit the patient, and they're the eyes and the ears of the doctor and report back to the doctor what they're seeing. If they think there needs to be changes to medications, they'll contact the physician that you have chosen um, to handle the care, the medications, and we will collaborate with that care team at the facility to make sure we're on the same page and that everyone understands what the plan of care is for that individual. You know what?
Go ahead.
Dale, there's one more question. It says, is there a method to evaluate patient
Oh,
satisfaction? It says,
I'm
if
sorry.
so, what are the goals and results? That's an excellent question.
Yes.
Um, at hospice, we do send out a survey to the primary caregiver, um, and we do identify during the time of service, we identify who the primary family contact is, who is the person that's primarily providing that hands-on care to the loved one. And I believe it's 90 days after the patient's death, um, a survey is sent. We do not send the survey. This is from an outside agency that sends out the surveys and compile all the results that are posted on a website so that you can look up what the patient satisfaction surveys are for any hospice. I believe it's any hospice that accepts Medicare or Medicaid insurance that this information is available online. I don't know the website. I could find out though. Any other
Okay.
questions, Dale, or is
I,
that it?
I think that's all we've got for you, Cynthia. So thank you, Cynthia. Wonderful job. Much appreciated.